Lieutenant Edgerly wrote to his wife that a D Company trooper, Private Patrick Golden, did everything he was supposed to do on the first day, but that night after the firing stopped, he asked a sergeant if the Indians would return. The sergeant guessed they would return in the morning. Golden then began to cry, and he said, "Tom, if they come back, they will kill me." There are two other accounts of Golden's behavior, very different, but Edgerly's is considered the most reliable. Next morning, he said, when he and Private Steins came to a large rifle pit, with Golden alone in the middle of it, Steins asked, "Paddy, whose hole is this?" Golden didn't know, and because everybody else was hiding in a pit, Edgerly and Steins threw themselves down next to him, one on either side. Moments later, a bullet streaked through the crest of the pit, showering them with dirt, and struck Golden. He groaned once, Edgerly wrote, pushed with his right foot, and was dead. Other men fought bravely at first, like Golden, but after a while grew timid. Others, for reasons known only to themselves, behaved just the opposite. Benteen's berserk charge turned out to be a spectacular success. The closest warriors fled from these savage bluecoats, not one of whom was injured. But then, just as they got back to the pits, a bullet hit the weeping coward between the eyes. Presumably he was hit by an Indian bullet, although some enraged member of Benteen's squad may have murdered him. The captain's view of this absurd charge, which he called the Chinese Act, is neither idealistic nor heroic. He was a pragmatic man. He understood the psychological effect of noise, so he instructed his volunteers to shout, and the astonished warriors fell head over heels in their efforts to escape. Not long afterward, Benteen was inspecting the line, when a sergeant raised his head and a bullet knocked off his hat. "Damn you," Benteen said, "I told you to keep down." The sergeant grinned and said, "Why don't you keep down, Captain?" Benteen, who referred to his wife as Mother, said, "Oh, I'm all right. Mother sewed some good medicine in my blouse before I left home, so they won't get me." Enlisted men usually become exasperated when an officer exposes himself to the enemy because it draws fire. But again and again we are told by troopers who served with Benteen on the hill that his conviction of immortality reassured them. Although the day was hot, he never rested. Back and forth he went, giving advice, examining bulwarks, encouraging the troops. His shirt tail had worked out of his pants and hung over his rump like a flag, while he tramped around saying, "This is a groundhog case, men. It is live or die. We must fight it out." On the afternoon of the 26th, quite a few Indians dressed up in 7th Cavalry coats taken from Custer's dead. Some wore military hats, and at least one carried a guidon, so the renegade whites, seen by Private Pym, were not altogether imaginary. In spite of such macabre evidence before their eyes, the trapped men did not suspect what had happened. From the rifle pits, they gazed at Sioux warriors wearing blue uniforms with yellow cavalry piping, they looked at the flag, and they asked each other why Custer had abandoned them. During this afternoon, a file of mounted Indians paused in the valley to contemplate the men on Reno Hill, and among their horses was a golden buckskin with distinctive white patches. The identity of these Indians has not been learned, but several troopers who had been with the 7th for a long time said this buckskin pony belonged to the Oglala war chief Crazy Horse, whose presence suggested that a final assault was near. Whoever they were, they dismounted and settled themselves in a circle for a smoke. It is said that they flashed signals with mirrors and gestured with feathered lances. Lances would indicate Cheyennes rather than Sioux. Nevertheless, it is conceivable that the man on the golden buckskin was Crazy Horse. Many Indians eventually came to regard this Oglala as their greatest chief, more important than Red Cloud or Sitting Bull. He was known as a man who walked through the village without speaking or noticing anybody. Sioux loved to dance and sing, but he never joined a dance, not even the sun dance, and nobody ever heard him sing. He was small, with a narrow face, and his eyes looked beyond things. Journalists liked to portray him as being utterly reckless in battle, but an Oglala who rode with him said this was not true. At critical moments, Crazy Horse would dismount before shooting. "He is the only Indian I ever knew who did that often. He wanted to be sure that he hit what he aimed at. He didn't like to start a battle unless he had it all planned out in his head and knew he was going to win." This is what distinguished him from his younger brother, Little Hawk. Old men of the tribe thought Little Hawk would become greater than Crazy Horse, but Little Hawk was impetuous. He crossed the Platte on a raiding expedition and never came back. Sometime later, Crazy Horse went looking for his brother's body, which he found and buried. He never boasted about what he did, nor would he take part in the lamentation that traditionally followed the death of a friend or relative. When he was a boy, the adults often discovered him standing in the shadows listening to their conversation, and when he grew up, he continued to listen. He attended very few councils. Even then, he would not speak. He always listened. His father was an Oglala holy man. His mother came from a different tribe. Most scholars think she was a Brule, a sister of Chief Spotted Tail, although Dr. V.T. McGillicuddy said she was a Miniconjou of the Cheyenne River Sioux, whose chief was Touch the Clouds. In either case, emigrants on the Oregon Trail frequently noticed a fair-skinned boy among the Sioux near Fort Laramie and thought he must be a captive white child. At this time, nearly all of the Plains Indians were restless. One ugly experience with whites created the next. Some of the Blackfoot had been stealing various items from Fort McKenzie, and may also have stolen horses, so the manager, Francis Chardon, resolved to punish them. He greeted one party with a cannon blast. It has been alleged that Chardon's welcome killed about 30 Blackfoot, which probably is an exaggeration. The most detailed and reliable account seems to be that of a trader, Charles Larpenteur, known as Lumpy Neck because of a goiter. He was not present, but he talked to a Fort McKenzie clerk and was informed that these Indians had murdered an employee, a Negro by the name of Reese. This murder, not petty theft, caused Chardon to concoct his disastrous plan. Whatever the motive, Chardon enlisted one Alexander Harvey, who, wishing no better fun, agreed to take an important part. Harvey carried a bowie knife, or dirk, the French word for which is dague. An old man named Berger also was enlisted, evidently because Chardon decided to let 3 Blackfoot chiefs into the stockade, where they would be assassinated, after which the gates would swing open and the cannon would blast the crowd outside. Any survivors would of course run away, leaving the ground covered with buffalo robes, jewelry, beaded moccasins, everything they had brought to trade. Chardon's plan did not work because the Blackfoot leaders inside the stockade suspected treachery. 2 of them escaped. The other went down with a bullet in one leg. The cannon was quickly fired, killing 3, not 30, but wounding 2 others. Harvey rushed out of the fort and stabbed these wounded Indians. I was told he then licked the blood off the daggy and afterward made the squaws of the fort dance the scalp dance around the scalps. The Blackfoot stopped trading at Mackenzie and moved across the boundary into Canada, but they returned to attack the fort. They may have burned it. After so much time, the reports are contradictory. One way or another, what had been a mutually profitable and agreeable relationship was destroyed. In Canada, things were different. The Hudson's Bay Company, part of a smoothly functioning empire, understood how to live with Indians, whereas the newly arrived, impatient, disorganized, aggressive Americans did not. They streamed westward, lacerating the earth. George Bent, a half-breed son of trader William Bent, mentions emigrant trains several miles long, the huge freight wagons with white canvas tops resembling ships at sea. Indians who watched these creaking trains approach every season, growing longer and longer, could foresee the result. Cottonwood groves, where they had camped for generations, began to diminish. Grass in the valleys was eaten down to the ground. With the 1849 gold rush came cholera. The Sioux and Cheyennes, closest to the emigrant road, suffered most, but the epidemic spread northward to the Blackfeet, southward into Kiowa and Comanche territory. Bent visited empty villages where he saw teepees full of bodies. In the summer of 1853, a longtime trader and recently appointed Indian agent, Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, traveled among the Cheyennes, Arapahoes, and Sioux. They are in abject want of food half the year, and their reliance for that scanty supply and the rapid decrease of the buffalo is fast disappearing. Their women are pinched with want, and their children constantly crying out with hunger. 1 year after that, when the boy who would become Crazy Horse was 12 or 13 years old, a Mormon's cow wandered close to a Sioux camp just east of Fort Laramie, and a Miniconjou named High Forehead could not resist temptation. Whether he wanted the hide, or hungered for a steak, is the subject of learned disagreement, and Bent describes the animal as a lame ox straying near the road. George Hyde, a cautious scholar, says a Mormon was leading a lame or worn-out ox when it was shot, and he considers the Indians' behavior purely provocative. William Bordeaux, whose grandfather owned a nearby trading post, and who got the story of this incident from a great-aunt named Tripe, says that an emigrant party left a crippled ox by the wayside. Historian Donald J. Berthrong thinks High Forehead meant to kill the Mormon, but hit the beast instead. In any case, Sioux tribal elders offered to pay reasonable damages, say $10 or a cow, maybe 2 cows. The facts are lost in a spiral of dust. What does seem clear is that a belligerent Irish lieutenant fresh from West Point, John Grattan, set out to arrest High Forehead. This was both illegal and stupid. It violated a provision of the 1851 Laramie Treaty, which stipulates that Reds and Whites should punish their own malefactors, and it was stupid to send Grattan because the Sioux detested him. He was a familiar type, the apple-green egoist. On various occasions he had strutted around the post, thrusting a fist at Indians, calling them cowards, warning them to look out. Beyond doubt, Grattan wanted and expected trouble when he left the fort to go after High Forehead. "When I give the order," he told his men, "you may fire as you damned please." His posse included a sergeant, a corporal, 27 luckless troopers, and a frightened interpreter named Auguste Lucien, who was at least half drunk, and who rode around shouting that all the Sioux were going to be killed, and he, Auguste, pronounced Wayus by the Indians, he himself, Auguste, was going to eat their hearts. J.P. Dunn, in Massacres of the Mountains, says this wild bunch consisted of just 19 men. No matter. The crucial element was Grattan's artillery, a 12-pound field piece and a mountain howitzer. Precisely what happened will never be learned. There seems to have been a conference during which Wayus shouted additional insults. The soldiers leveled their guns. The Indians thought they were about to fire. A shot was heard by men watching from the flat roof of Bordeaux's trading post. More shots. Grattan let fly with the heavy stuff. William Bordeaux was told by Great-Aunt Tripe that the hired man, Dominic Bray, rode up a nearby knoll after the first shots were heard. Bray returned at great speed to report that the Sioux encampment was boiling. The trader himself and several other men, some of whom were married to squaws, hurried to the camp, but arrived too late. Grattan's conference with the Sioux may have fallen apart because of an outrageous misunderstanding. He may have responded to some remark as an Indian would by exclaiming, "Houn, houn," meaning, "Yes, all right, I agree." But the troopers thought he cried, "Now, now," and promptly opened fire. It sounds like a vaudeville skit. It sounds implausible, yet this is why there was no J Company in Custer's regiment. J, when spoken, may be misunderstood as A, and if clumsily written, it looks like I. Well, when things quieted down, the drunk interpreter and every white-skin except one lay dead. Private John Cuddy either escaped and managed to hide among some wild rose bushes, or he was protected by Indians who had wisely avoided the confrontation. William Bordeaux said his great-uncle, Swift Bear, found Cuddy in the bushes, bleeding so much that he had tried to plug the wounds with sagebrush. Swift Bear carried him to the trading post. Later he was carried to Fort Laramie, where he died. As for Grattan, the Sioux terminated his visit with extreme prejudice in the form of 24 arrows, one arrow passing completely through his skull. His face must have been pounded to mush with rocks or clubs, because he could be identified only by his pocket watch. The single Indian casualty was a Brule chief named Whirling Bear. Brave bear, conquering bear, bear that scatters enemies. He was shot in the back, presumably by Grattan or the drunk interpreter. As a result of all this, the Sioux came near slaughtering everybody at Bordeaux's trading post, but finally were bought off. Still enraged, they plundered an American Fur Company depot. Then, having had some experience with whites, they loaded their mortally wounded chief on a travois and fled north. Whirling Bear soon died. His ceremonially wrapped body was placed on a scaffold beside the Niobrara River, close to the mouth of the Snake. Grattan's soldiers were buried on a plateau in extremely shallow graves. so shallow that a caravan of Mormons en route to the Promised Land about a month later observed cadaverous heads peeping through the sod. Eastern newspapers reported the treacherous massacre of a gallant young West Point lieutenant with all his men, and the public responded, as always, by clamoring for revenge. Nor did it take long for the bad judgment of Grattan and that of his superior, who had authorized the arrest of High Forehead, to be magically transformed. Their foolishness became a cunning redskin plot. The lame ox had been shot neither for its hide nor its succulent ribs, but in order to lure these brave soldiers out of the fort. An army inspector arrived. He recorded the testimony of witnesses, which testimony was forwarded along with the inspector's conclusion. The time has now fully arrived for teaching these barbarians how to appreciate and respect the power, the justice, the generosity, and magnanimity of the United States. What this meant was that 2 generations of delicate but peaceful coexistence would be replaced by a generation of savagery. Arapahoes and Cheyennes who had nothing to do with Grattan's folly remained where they were, encamped near Fort Laramie. Although they had not participated, they were affected. The Cheyenne agent reported that on his next visit they behaved with great insolence, the sauciest Indians I've ever seen. They galloped around the corral, they fired shots overhead, they demanded that no more emigrants travel the Platte Road. They wanted $4,000 cash, they wanted the rest of their government annuity in guns and cartridges, and 1,000 white women for wives. Well. Crazy Horse, Curly as he was then known, had been so shocked by the explosive meeting at Fort Laramie that when his people fled north, he left them somewhere along the way. He spent 3 days on a hilltop without food or sleep, hoping for supernatural guidance. He wedged pebbles between his toes and put rocks under his back so that he could stay awake while meditating upon this experience with whites. At last, weak and dizzy, he thought he saw his horse approach, carrying on its back a warrior who flourished no scalps, whose unbound hair hung below his waist, and who wore a smooth brown pebble behind one ear. The warrior's body had been decorated with hail spots, and a streak of lightning descended from his forehead to his chin. Bullets and arrows attacked him, but fell away without touching him. A storm broke, yet he passed through unharmed. People clutched at him, trying to restrain him, but he rode through them with a red-backed hawk flying above his head. Curly did not reveal this manifestation to anybody until he was 16 and ready to become a warrior. From then on, he painted white hail spots on his body and a red lightning bolt down one cheek before going into battle. He tied a brown pebble behind one ear, wore the red-backed hawk on his head, and threw a handful of dust, perhaps symbolic of the storm, across himself and his pony. Except for moccasins and breechcloth, he rode naked. When he was about 18, he participated in a fight against some Arapahoes trapped on a rocky knoll. Several times he charged them. He killed 2, but unwisely scalped them, either forgetting or ignoring the fact that the warrior in his vision kept no scalps, and because in this respect he had violated the message of his presiding spirit, an arrow struck him in the leg. His bravery against these Arapahoes was celebrated, and in recognition of what he had done, he received his father's name, Crazy Horse. His father, the Oglala holy man, thereafter called himself Worm. So runs the most creditable account of how Crazy Horse acquired that name. It has been said also that while taking a steam bath with his father and a war chief named Hump, he grew dizzy and saw the apparition. When he told the older men about it, they said he had seen a vision of himself. Then there is a popular legend that during his birth a wild pony galloped by his mother's lodge. If the first story is correct, as many historians believe, one might reasonably ask how his father got the name Crazy Horse. And once upon a time, no doubt, that question could have been answered. A few years after the fight with Arapahoes, a medicine man named Chips created a charm for the young warrior, a small white stone suspended from a thong. This thong probably was slung across one shoulder, so that the magic stone nestled under his left arm. The charm was devised in 1862 or 1863, and after he began wearing it, he was never again wounded, although a number of ponies were killed beneath him. Strangely duplicating the luck of his blue-jacketed doppelganger, Custer. About this time, one of Red Cloud's nieces, Black Buffalo Woman, was married to a violent man whose name usually is translated No Water or No Face. He is said to have been a jealous husband. But young Crazy Horse, whose eyes looked beyond things, ignored such inconsequential matters. Stories of his involvement with the wife of No Water, No Face have been told so many times that it becomes a palimpsest, erased, scraped, revised, until the original truth cannot be perceived. William Bordeaux, whose information came from elderly relatives, said that Crazy Horse eloped with No Water's wife as a way of getting even for some intra-tribal dispute. The infuriated husband caught up with them and fired a shot which grazed the cheek of Crazy Horse. The two men began wrestling, but were separated by the famous 7-foot warrior Touch the Clouds. At last, to avoid further trouble, Crazy Horse relinquished his prize. Or he might have fallen in love with her when she was single, because it is said that while he was on a raiding expedition in Crow territory, she got married, perhaps at the urging of Red Cloud. When Crazy Horse returned and found out about this, he went into his mother's lodge and did not emerge for several days. Then he visited Crow territory again, alone, and when he got back, he flung 2 crow scalps to the dogs. He took no more scalps for the rest of his life. When he was a youth, wild with excitement, he scalped 2 Arapahoes and 2 crows for some reason that cannot logically be understood. This is the consensus of scholars. However, Captain John Bourke of Crook's 3rd Cavalry states that he himself owned a shirt trimmed with scalps which had been the property of Crazy Horse. How many trophies dangled from it, Bourke does not say. This shirt, presumably the same, used to be on exhibit at the Fort Robinson Museum. Perhaps it did belong to the famous Oglala, although such vanity would not have been characteristic. At any rate, he was unable to forget Black Buffalo Woman. Finally, when she had 3 children, he showed how much he cared for her by giving a feast, whereupon she deposited her children with relatives, told her husband goodbye, and moved in with Crazy Horse. This was permissible. A Sioux woman could change her mind about husbands, and just as in other societies, the jilted husband was expected to behave decently. No Water did not. He entered the lodge of the newlyweds while they were eating, and he shot his rival in the jaw. The bullet was meant to catch Crazy Horse between the eyes, and a second bullet might have followed, except for the presence of Touch the Clouds. No Water was rebuked for this assault, because it was he, not Crazy Horse, who had violated Sioux tribal structure. He was therefore expected to apologize by offering a gift of ponies, which he did. His gift was accepted, so the feud should have ended. It did not. One day Crazy Horse attacked No Water. As a result, he himself was disgraced. Some very old Oglalas who had known the chief were interviewed by Eleanor Hinman in 1930. The account given by He-Dog of this fight in the lodge and of what followed is the most detailed that exists. He-Dog, narrating the story through interpreter John Kohlhoff, said that Crazy Horse and Black Buffalo Woman were seated by the fire in a friend's lodge when No Water rushed in and cried, "I have come." Crazy Horse jumped up, reaching for a knife. No Water shot him beneath the left nostril. The bullet broke his upper jaw, and he collapsed into the fire. No Water then left the tent and told his companions that he had killed Crazy Horse. No Water had been riding a fast mule when he came looking for revenge, but he did not ride away when he learned that his bullet had only wounded Crazy Horse. He disappeared. Friends of Crazy Horse tried to find him because they wanted to kill him. When they could not find him, they killed his mule. After things had calmed down, No Water sent Crazy Horse 2 very good ponies, a roan and a bay. They avoided each other until one day near the mouth of the Bighorn, where both of them were hunting buffalo, No Water jumped on a buckskin belonging to somebody else and rode off as fast as he could. Crazy Horse chased him all the way to the Yellowstone. After such a narrow escape, No Water went south to the Red Cloud Agency and stayed there with the Indians who loafed around. That was where he stayed during the war with the soldiers. Black Buffalo Woman had a 4th child, a light-haired girl, and He-Dog said many people believed this child was the daughter of Crazy Horse, but it was never known for certain. So one way or another, the fight between these 2 dangerous men concluded. Black Buffalo Woman may have gathered her children and returned to her husband, At least it is known she and Crazy Horse separated. As for Crazy Horse himself, the passion he felt may have given way to self-disgust. All in all, it had been a messy business. When he was about 26, he married Black Shawl, or Black Robe, not with much enthusiasm. His parents might have arranged it. They lived together and had a daughter. Then Black Shawl developed tuberculosis, which was a common disease, and after that she stayed at her parents' lodge, gradually declining. The baby died of cholera while Crazy Horse was once again harassing the crows. When he got back and learned about this, he fell apart. The Oglala camp had moved during his absence, and the infant's body had been left on a scaffold now 70 miles away. He rode off to find it. A frontier character named Frank Gruard, who lived with the Oglalas for several years, claimed to have accompanied Crazy Horse on this pilgrimage. Gruard is not dependable, at least his biography is not, so the account must be read with suspicion. But Gruard said that Crazy Horse mounted the scaffold, lay down beside his daughter's body, which was wrapped in a buffalo robe, and remained there for 3 days. It sounds like Juana la Loca, the Mad Queen of Spain, who opened her young husband's coffin and tore apart the shroud to kiss his feet. After the death of this little girl, he became indifferent to his own life, taking unreasonable chances, and frequently left the village without revealing what he meant to do. During this period, quite a few solitary miners, panning the Black Hills for gold, were found dead but not scalped, each with an arrow driven into the ground beside the corpse. Any wandering Sioux might have killed these men and disdained their scalps, but the presence of that symbolic arrow implies an unusual mind. He always was strange, Black Elk said, and he grew more strange. People would see him outside the village, alone and cold. Once my father found him out alone like that, and he said to my father, "Uncle, you have noticed me, the way I act, but do not worry. There are caves and holes for me to live in, and out here the spirits may help me. I am making plans for the good of my people." He was always a queer man. 10 or 12 years after his marriage to Black Shawl, he married a French Cheyenne girl, Nellie Larrivee. Except for No Water's wife, he does not seem to have pursued women. Instead, he seems merely to have accepted them, yielding to their presence. His sister told about seeing a woman enter his lodge and speak to Black Shawl, who was sewing a robe. The side of the lodge had been rolled up because of the heat, which made it possible to listen and watch. Crazy Horse returned while they were talking. The unfamiliar woman met him at the entrance, saying, "I am Joe Larravee's daughter, so I'm part white. I've heard about your great deeds, for my father has told us about you and your victory over Longhair. He says that you are worthy to be the mate of any woman, and though I realize that you already have a wife, I picked this day to offer myself to you for your second mate. I have taken the matter up with your wife, and she has consented." He replied that he thought she was sincere. "So bring your belongings and be one of my family." As he grew older, his odd ways became more apparent. He would not smoke a pipe unless each smoker tamped down the tobacco with the thumb, not with the finger. It had to be a thumb. Much of what he did, no matter how peculiar, can be explained. Some things cannot. Captain Bourke, who was introduced to him by Frank Gruard in 1877, described him as 5 foot 8 inches tall, lithe and sinewy, with a scar on his face, which must have resulted from No Water's bullet. Bourke judged him to be about 30 years old, though in fact he was close to 40. According to an Oglala calendar, he was born the year Left Hand Big Nose was killed by Shoshones, which is to say 1839. He had made hundreds of friends by his charity towards the poor, as it was a point of honor with him never to keep anything for himself excepting weapons of war. I never heard an Indian mention his name, save in terms of respect. Gruard states that he was light-complexioned, with sandy hair, and did not have the customary high cheekbones of an Indian. Short Buffalo agreed with Gruard's description. The chief was neither tall nor short, not thin, yet not broad. His hair and skin were light. He wore an Iroquois shell necklace, but Short Buffalo did not know, or chose not to say, where Crazy Horse got this distinctive ornament. He also liked to wear a scarlet blanket plucked from a wagon train in 1867. His features were unlike those of most Indians. His face was narrow, with a high, sharp nose. He had black eyes that hardly ever looked straight at a man. General Miles called him the embodiment of ferocity, a fierce, restless warrior who had become the recognized leader of the Oglalas by the time he was 26. There are no authenticated photographs of him. It was said that he did not want to lose himself inside the white man's box. Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy tried several times to get a picture, but Crazy Horse resisted. "My friend," he would answer, "why should you wish to shorten my life by taking from me my shadow?" D.F. Barry was convinced that no photographer caught the elusive chief. He himself photographed Low Dog at Fort Buford in 1881, a picture sometimes misrepresented as being Crazy Horse, and he caught the chief's brother Wild Horse, who resembled him, but Wild Horse seems to be as close as Barry got. An 1874 photo, credited to Major Wilhelm of the 8th Infantry, shows a dark-skinned man wearing a huge feather bonnet. From the statements of those who knew Crazy Horse, or at least had seen him, Wilhelm's chief must be somebody else, perhaps Flatiron. An ostentatious bonnet, like the scalp-trimmed shirt, would not be characteristic. Besides, at the time Major Wilhelm supposedly took this picture, his regiment was stationed in Arizona. Wilhelm did not reach Crazy Horse territory until 1890. In the W.H. Over collection at the University of South Dakota, there is a photograph of a remote, angular, light-skinned Sioux with an averted look of distant intensity. This was taken by S.J. Morrow in 1876 or 1877 and has been labeled Crazy Horse. Colonel Graham says Morrow himself labeled it, and the photo may be authentic. Other scholars think this might be a portrait of Crazy in the Lodge. John Selliver took a picture labeled Crazy Horse and Son, which is remarkably unconvincing for various reasons, such as the fact that Selliver's chief must be 10 or 15 years older than Crazy Horse was at the time of his death. Short Buffalo told Eleanor Hinman about 2 photographs of a man on horseback, which he, Short Buffalo, considered authentic. And he said, "I have seen a 3rd photograph that I'm sure was he, because it showed him on the pinto horse he rode in the Custer fight. I could not possibly make a mistake about that horse, and nobody rode it but Crazy Horse. The man who owns these pictures got them from soldiers who used to be at Fort Robinson. He has quite a collection of pictures of chiefs. I think he lives out in California now, near the National Park there. I do not remember his name." In August of 1876, 2 months after the Little Bighorn, when the Cheyennes and Sioux thought it was time to split up, Sitting Bull led many of his people to Canada, where they would be safe from American vengeance, while others slipped away to agencies in order to obtain food from gullible Washichus. But the strange Oglala refused to leave the land that always had been his home. Yet he would not register at an agency, and he spoke with contempt of Indians who negotiated the sale of the Black Hills, saying, "One does not sell the earth upon which the people walk." Red Cloud, near the end of his life, would be accused of obtuse and unsubduable Indianism. The same must be said of Crazy Horse. Misinterpretation, deliberate or unintentional, brought about his death in 1877. Frank Gruard told General Crook that Crazy Horse would ride north against the whites during the Nez Perce campaign, although the message should have been that he would ride north to assist the whites. Colonel Graham thinks this was an honest mistake, a classic example of erroneous interpretation. However, Dr. McGillicuddy called it a purposeful misinterpretation of his words by Frank Gruard, who had once been a friend of Crazy Horse but was now his enemy and feared him. The trader Louis Bordeaux was present at an earlier conference when Crazy Horse and Lieutenant Philo Clark talked about the Nez Perces. On this occasion, too, Gruard interpreted. Clark asked if Crazy Horse would help fight the Nez Perces. Crazy Horse replied that under certain conditions, which were then enumerated, he and his Oglalas would fight until not one Nez Perce was left. But Gruard told Clark the Oglalas would fight until not a soldier was left. Clark then turned to Louis Bordeaux and asked if this was indeed what Crazy had said. Bordeaux said it was not, and gave his own translation, but was interrupted by Gruard, who called him a liar. Whether the interpretation was malicious or accidental, Crook resolved to arrest Crazy Horse. He was escorted to Fort Robinson, where he realized that the whites meant to imprison him. He pulled a knife. Little Big Man grabbed his arm. Moments later, Private William Gentles speared him with a bayonet. He may not have been surprised. Eleanor Hinman interviewed an Oglala woman named Carrie Slowbear in 1930. Hinman asked this woman if she knew why Crazy Horse refused to visit Washington. Carrie Slowbear replied that at first Crazy Horse had been willing to go, but then he thought something would be done to him, because another Indian said the whites planned to kill him, either in Washington or at Fort Robinson. Hinman asked who had told him so. Carrie Slowbear said, "Little Big Man told him that." Major H.R. Lemley, then a 9th Infantry lieutenant at Fort Robinson, claimed that Little Big Man was a paid spy employed by the whites, which, if true, makes him a double agent. But with which faction did Little Big Man truly feel allied? Or was he indifferent? Regarding the death of Crazy Horse, Dr. McGillicuddy would not equivocate. A combination of treachery, jealousy, and unreliable reports simply resulted in a frame-up, and he was railroaded to his death. McGillicuddy went on to say that it was just as well, because he would have gone to the Dry Tortugas as a prisoner for life. McGillicuddy's opinion is substantiated by at least 2 other men who were present. Lemley wrote, "Already it had been planned to imprison the chief in Fort Marion at St. Augustine, Florida. He was to have been taken in an ambulance at midnight with a troop of cavalry for an escort to Fort Laramie, thence by the Deadwood stagecoach to Cheyenne, and by trains east and south." The Spotted Tail agent, Captain Jesse Lee, said he was told by a 3rd Cavalry captain that his troop had been detailed to escort the chief from the guardhouse at midnight, push on rapidly to the railroad, and from there he was to be sent a prisoner to the Dry Tortugas, Florida. General James Allison, editor of the Journal of the Military Service Institution, studied this mysterious business at some length. He absolved Gruard of malice, accusing him only of incompetence, but denounced Washington officials. There is little doubt that certain higher authorities found appetite keener and sleep sweeter through the knowledge that Crazy Horse had, through hook or crook, become a good Indian and would give no further trouble. A simple, easy, and reasonable solution was to state that he had been killed in an attempt to escape from the guardhouse, and let it go at that. Crazy Horse made a speech just before he died, a rather long speech. After being bayoneted, he had been carried to the post adjutant's office. His blanket was spread on the floor, and there for several hours he lay unconscious, bleeding internally. When he awoke, he lifted himself on one elbow. According to interpreter Baptiste Poirier, the chief said he had not been hostile to whites. Buffalo supplied his people with food and clothing, and they preferred to chase buffalo rather than live idly at the agencies, arguing with each other and sometimes starving. But the gray fox, Crook, came in midwinter and destroyed their village. Then came Longhair in the same way. When the Indians first saw Longhair, they wanted to escape, but could not, so they were obliged to fight. They fought because the government would not let them alone. Then, said Crazy Horse, he decided to live in peace on the Red Cloud Agency. And at this point he interjected a seemingly irrelevant comment, saying he had taken a half-breed wife. Why did he make such a remark? Perhaps it related to his expressed desire to live amicably with whites, Nellie being half white. All the same, it is a curious thing for a dying man to mention. He then reiterated that all he ever wanted was to be left alone, and had come to the agency to talk, but white men had tried to imprison him, and a soldier had run a bayonet into him. This concluded the speech. Very weakly he began his death song. Indians outside the adjutant's office heard him singing, and almost at once his parents begged to be admitted. Lemley refused, saying he had no authority to let them in. But after Crazy Horse was dead, he permitted them to enter. He described them as a wrinkled little old couple. He said they bent over the body of their son, crooning to it, and fondled it as if he had been a broken doll, and they, strangely withered pygmies or children. Excerpts from the diary of Agent Jesse Lee seem to indicate that he had no part in the plot to murder Crazy Horse, if there was a plot. Thursday, September 6th, 1877. No one can imagine my feelings this morning. I often ask myself, was it treachery or not? To the Indian mind, how will it appear? My part in this transaction is to me a source of torture. Started Touch the Clouds and Swift Bear to Spotted Tail Agency in the ambulance. Had a long talk with General Bradley. He did most of the talking. I felt so miserable that I could scarcely say anything. Saturday, September 8th, 1877. Everything is quiet, and I think will remain so. Crazy Horse's body was brought to this agency and put on a little platform, Indian fashion, on the hill overlooking the post, not half a mile away. Whenever I go out of my quarters, I see the red blanket in which his body is wrapped, and thus is recalled to my mind and heart Crazy Horse's pathetic and tragic end. Wednesday, September 12th, 1877. I think it was yesterday that I received word from Crazy Horse's father and mother, who were mourning in Indian fashion beside the body of their son from daylight to dark, that the cattle at night would not disturb his body. They asked me to have a skeleton fence put around his body. So Jack Atkinson and I loaded a spring wagon with a few posts and some rough planks and went up there, and in an hour made a fence. George Hyde, acerbic and patient biographer of the Teton Sioux, sounds baffled by the attention devoted to this renowned chief, whom he considered to be morose, sullen, and rather limited. Says Mr. Hyde, the Crazy Horse cult is amazing. It was evidently started among the Oglalas at Pine Ridge, aided by some white admirers of the Oglala fighting chief. They depict Crazy Horse as the kind of being never seen on earth, a genius in war, yet a lover of peace, a statesman who apparently never thought of the interests of any human being outside his own camp, a dreamer, a mystic, and a kind of Sioux Christ who was betrayed in the end by his own disciples, Little Big Man, Touch the Clouds, Big Road, Jumping Shield, and the rest. And he continues, rhetorically, one is inclined to ask, what is it all about? Whatever it was about, this quite possibly was the laconic individual, intimidating even to those who knew him all his life, who rode a golden buckskin and settled himself on the valley floor to smoke a pipe and contemplate the bluecoats trapped on the bluff. From their viewpoint high above, Reno's beleaguered men presently observed something as providential as it was unexpected. The tribes dismantled their enormous village and began moving south. Terry and Gibbon were approaching. Such is the usual explanation for the departure of these Indians. No doubt there would have been a second battle of the Little Bighorn if the hostiles had stayed where they were. Yet they may have left for a different reason. Sitting Bull allegedly wished to spare the lives of Reno's men, and an Oglala messenger named Knife Chief rode around the bluff notifying everybody. If Sitting Bull did indeed call off the attack, it was not because of any affection for whites, whom he hated with abiding and impenetrable rancor, but because he understood how vindictive they could be. If all the soldiers were slaughtered, the whites would insist upon another battle, and another, whereas they might quit molesting Indians if these soldiers were permitted to escape. The story may or may not be true, but what seems rather well documented is the fact that Reno's men would have been allowed to withdraw. If they had retreated in the direction from which they had come, they would not have been pursued. According to David Humphreys Miller, all of the Indians he interviewed were convinced they had shown the soldiers how foolish it was to attack the village, and most of them felt the survivors should be allowed to warn other troops out of the area. Only one thing is certain. Later that afternoon, the lodges were packed on travois, and a brightly colored horde began to move. Reno's officers studied this movement through field glasses. The entire camp, Unkpapa, Brule, Miniconjou, Two Kettle, Sunti, Oglala, Sanzarks, Blackfeet, Cheyenne, all of the tribes were flowing southward with savage dignity toward the Bighorn Mountains. Thousands of ponies and travois poles lifted a vast cloud of dust. The length of the column was fully equal to that of a large division of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac, said Reno. Some troopers thought it was 5 miles long. Benteen estimated it at 3 miles long and half a mile wide. They had an advance guard and platoons formed, and were in as regular military order as a corps or division. One member of H Company, Charles Windolph, recalled many years later, "The heavy smoke seemed to lift for a few moments, and there in the valley below we caught glimpses of thousands of Indians on foot and horseback, with their pony herds and travois, dogs and pack animals, and all the trappings of a great camp slowly moving southward. It was like some biblical exodus, the Israelites moving into Egypt, a mighty tribe on the march." Lieutenant Edgerly felt less poetic. "I thought before the ponies commenced to move that it was like a lot of brown underbrush. It was the largest number of quadrupeds I ever saw in my life. It looked as though a heavy carpet was being moved over the ground." Captain Thomas French, who owned a .50 caliber Springfield, and Sergeant John Ryan, who had a 15-pound Sharps equipped with a telescopic sight, spoke the last lines of the Little Bighorn drama. From the hilltop they took long-distance pot shots at the vanishing horde. They did not hit a thing, so far as anybody knows. But this defiant epilogue probably gave the exhausted troops some satisfaction. Interpreter Fred Gerard, trapped in the valley, got a fearfully close look at the spectacle observed by Reno's men through field glasses. Gerard was close enough to see wounded braves on travois, dead men lashed to the backs of ponies, and he could hear the squaws wailing. When this reddish-brown traveling carpet passed almost out of sight, Reno's soldiers ventured down to the river where they drank and filled their canteens. Nobody felt like celebrating, and that night they stayed on the hilltop, moving only a little to get away from the stench. The departure of the Indians could be a massive feint to draw them out of position, or, they reasoned, the ponies might need more grass, which meant that after the village was relocated, the warriors would come back. Major Reno addressed a message to General Terry on the morning of June 27th. "I've had a most terrific engagement with the hostile Indians. They left their camp last evening at sundown, moving due south in the direction of the Bighorn Mountains. I'm very much crippled and cannot possibly pursue. Lieutenants McIntosh and Hodgson and Dr. DeWolf are among the killed. I have many wounded and many horses and mules shot. I've lost both my own horses. I've not seen or heard from Custer." That same morning, just about the time Gerard awoke from his long nap with a mouthful of unswallowed salt pork, Reno's troops saw another dust cloud far to the north. They studied it anxiously, wondering if more Indians had come to join the party, but at last decided the dust was raised by General Crook. This does not seem to make sense. They had been expecting Terry to arrive from that direction, whereas Crook was thought to be somewhere to the south or southeast. But as they looked through field glasses at the approaching cavalry, they did not see any gray horses. Lieutenant Algernon Smith's E Company, which rode with Custer, had been mounted entirely on gray horses. Therefore, if Smith's Gray Horse Company was not part of this column, it must not be Custer, and without doubt Custer would have met Terry somewhere down the valley. After all, that was the plan. So if this could not be the reunited Terry-Custer army, it must be Crook. Cheer after cheer went up for General Crook as Terry and Gibbon approached. Lieutenant Godfrey remembered a scout arriving with a note dated June 26th, addressed to Custer. This scout had been detached on his mission before Terry learned of the disaster, and had spent all night trying to sneak around the village. Next came Lieutenant Bradley. Godfrey said to him, "Where is Custer?" Bradley answered, "I don't know, but I suppose he was killed, as we counted 197 dead bodies. I don't suppose any escaped." Benteen asked the same question of General Terry. Terry replied, "To the best of my knowledge and belief, he lies on this ridge about 4 miles below here, with all of his command killed." Benteen said, "I can hardly believe it. I think he's somewhere down the Bighorn grazing his horses. At the Battle of the Washita, he went off and left part of his command, and I think he would do it again." Terry answered that he was mistaken. He told Benteen to go look. Benteen returned from this trip very pale and disturbed. An officer who accompanied him reported that while they stood looking down at the general's naked body, Benteen said, "There he is, goddamn him. He will never fight any more." Nobody knew exactly where Custer went after he divided the regiment early Sunday afternoon, and in the years since then, only a little more has been learned. For a while he paralleled Reno's course toward the Unkpapa village, then led his 5 companies into the hills east of the Little Bighorn. He planned to ride northward until he could sweep down on the far end of the encampment. This much has always been clear. But even today his precise route is not known. The usual assumption is that he kept his troops out of sight until they reached the point where they were discovered, surrounded, and butchered. But before reaching this point, he may have tried to split the huge camp in half. At least there is evidence to suggest that he attacked the center, was repulsed, and only then continued northward to the fatal site. The bearer of the last message, John Martin, told Walter Camp in 1910 that he was with Custer very close to the Little Bighorn, and after being detached from the battalion he looked back. And I saw him and his command right down on the flat, within a few hundred yards of the river, retreating from it. 3 days later, Reno's men found the prints of metal-shod horses in a gully close to the water. These prints could have been made after the battle, when victorious warriors rode around on captured 7th Cavalry horses. Yet the testimony of several Indian participants seems to corroborate the idea of an attempted crossing, and the Crow scout, White Man Runs Him, agreed. White Man said that after dividing the regiment, Custer sent him up a knoll. "Go and look and see where I can make a success," Custer signaled. White Man did as he was told, and suggested a place to cross the river. Custer's battalion followed him. "We went down to the Little Horn until we came to a little coulee, and were moving towards the enemy's camp. We wanted to cross the river at that place. The Sioux fired at us. We then went up the hill to the ridge." One of Gibbon's scouts, Tom LaForge, was told by a Sioux that Custer's guide and interpreter, Minton or Michelet Mitch Boyer, died at the edge of the river. The Sioux found him there after the battle, alive, his back broken. He asked them to kill him, which they did. A Sioux then took his vest before shoving his body into the stream. LaForge said this vest, made of the skin of a spotted calf, was picked up near the water. He was a half-breed, his father being French, his mother a Santee Sioux, so the Indians knew him as Two Bodies, and very often they tried to kill him. Sitting Bull offered 100 ponies for his head. An Arapaho, one of 6 who had been camping with the Sioux and Cheyennes, said Mitch Boyer and a man with a bugle crossed the Little Bighorn and hid in some underbrush on the west bank, where they were caught and killed. The Arapaho, too, mentioned Boyer's distinctive calfskin vest, but he said Custer already was trapped on the slope when these men tried to escape. Boyer may have gone down just as the Sioux and the Arapaho said, but Custer's whereabouts at the time is a different problem. Besides, they might have been wrong. Gibbon stated that Boyer's corpse was found among the troops who died with Custer, several hundred yards from the Little Bighorn. He was the protege and pupil of the celebrated guide Jim Bridger. Now, the age of technology has produced, together with innumerable gadgets of questionable merit, a handy instrument called the metal detector, and the metal detector has pointed out shells and other artifacts, binoculars, canteens, spurs, pocket knives, brass buttons, trumpets, horseshoes, buckles, spoons, harmonicas, in quite a few places. Which is to say, the route of the doomed battalion can be approximately, if not absolutely, reconstructed. Of particular interest is the presence of a great many empty cartridges very close to the river in Medicine Tail Coulee. Here, too, after the battle, somebody found an enlisted man's pants hanging on a tree stump. And about 5 years later, Harry Moccasin was told by a Sioux that one soldier rode into their village, undoubtedly because his horse bolted. The identity of this unfortunate cannot be established, but it may have been Sergeant James Bustard of I Company. Whoever he was, he did not emerge from the village. Everything considered, there must have been a skirmish very near the water. Perhaps Custer ordered a full assault down Medicine Tail Coulee, but had to withdraw. Or possibly, as some tacticians believe, one company at the rear may have ventured down this ravine. Other students of the business think Custer divided his 5 companies, creating 2 battalions, and sent 2 companies down Medicine Tail, while the other 3 continued along the ridge. Lieutenant Godfrey in 1891 thought Custer never approached the Little Bighorn. The numerous bodies found scattered between the river and the ridge were supposed to be the first victims of the fight. I'm now satisfied that these were men who either survived those on the ridge or attempted to escape the massacre. By whatever path, he reached the head of this wandering village where he encountered a horde of Cheyennes. That he met them in this position was no accident. They were leading the other tribes, and for a reason which can be traced back 50 years. Early in the 19th century, under James Monroe, an Indian program began to take shape. God alone could guess how many millions of square miles of useless land unrolled beyond the frontier. Therefore, boost all eastern redskins west. Let them join their wild western cousins, leaving the United States to civilized people. Such was the government philosophy. So, having touched the pen to make everything legal, thereby ceding property they never knew they owned, except that they had lived on it as long as anybody could remember, these aborigines were nudged westward. Still, no matter what assurances they were given before touching the pen, the boundary of white civilization seeped toward them. This program accelerated when Jackson got into the White House. He had fought Indians in Tennessee, and he nourished few doubts. His attitude grew out of the frontier conviction that no redskin had any rights a white man was under moral or legal obligation to respect, an attitude which would prevail for at least a century. "I suggest the propriety of setting apart an ample district west of the Mississippi," he wrote in his first address to Congress. There went the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Creeks. Escorted to their new home by troops, several thousand died en route. By the end of Jackson's reign, at least 90,000 had been resettled, and it was assumed they would copy the life of Indians accustomed to the plains. There should be no shortage of buffalo, and the government would keep an eye on things through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Seminoles, who were supposed to leave, backed into their Florida swamps, and for 6 years confounded the majesty of the United States. Here and there a few would be captured by offering to discuss the situation under a white flag, at which time they could be overpowered and shipped west. Nevertheless, it proved to be an expensive, inconclusive, and exasperating struggle, which cost the lives of 1,500 soldiers, and at last the army gave up, having managed to execute or deport most of the Seminoles, leaving a few hundred in the swamps. 1842 saw the first westbound emigrant train pull out of Independence, Missouri, on what would become known as the Oregon Trail, 18 wagons carrying 100 whites. Next year, 10 times as many whites would follow this trail through Indian Territory. By 1848, California was in American hands, which meant that the intermediate Great Plains dividing the states no longer could be ignored. And with the '49 gold rush came not only more pale-faces than an Indian could imagine, but alcohol, guns, cholera, smallpox, venereal disease, and the ineradicable debris characteristic of industrial nations. The tribes grew increasingly restive. Even the monstrous buffalo herds tried to avoid this white plague. In 1851, a council of Plains Indians met with American politicians at Horse Creek, 35 miles east of Fort Laramie. 10,000 Indians showed up. Ponies darkened the hills. On September 6th, nearly 1,000 Sioux rode in column behind an American flag. Cheyennes gave a similarly peaceful demonstration. Numerous dogs were boiled and served. Old enemies voted friendship. Everybody danced. This council, which lasted almost 3 weeks, had been designed by Anglos to ensure the safety of emigrant trains. If the Indians would quit molesting emigrants, and if they would stop wandering around, thereby enabling the government to monitor their activities and punish them for transgressions, if, that is to say, they would make an effort to live like civilized people, they would be rewarded with all sorts of commodities. To the Anglos, it seemed a logical, reasonable approach to the hazardous condition of life on the plains. Nez Perces were not invited to Fort Laramie because they lived too far west, but they would later feel the pinch, and Chief Joseph's comment on white logic deftly summarizes the response of most Indians. "One might as well expect rivers to run backward as expect free men to live in a coop," he said. And he asked who had authorized white men to keep Indians in one place while the whites might travel as they pleased. To such an extraordinary question, of course, there could be no answer. The Sioux, Cheyennes, and every other tribe on the continent were of Joseph's mind. They thought they might live wherever they chose, a posture guaranteed to infuriate bureaucrats who believed quite rightly that wandering Indians would disrupt the system. The Sioux and Cheyennes, being numerous and particularly obdurate, were especially annoying. In 1868, the government arranged a treaty with the Sioux, setting apart for them a huge tract of land comprising the western half of what is now South Dakota. Commencing on the east bank of the Missouri, where the 46th parallel of north latitude crosses the same, thence along the low water mark down the said east bank to a point opposite where the northern line of the state of Nebraska strikes the river, then west across said river and along the northern line of Nebraska to the 104th degree of longitude west from Greenwich, thence north on said meridian. This area was reserved to them for all time. 6 years later, though, General Custer found gold in the Black Hills, with the inevitable resulting inroads of covetous settlers, as Colonel T.M. Coughlin explained the business in 1934. Because of these prospectors, often attended by families and followed by merchants, the Sioux and their Cheyenne allies grew more belligerent. Toward the close of 1875, the Indian unrest alarmed the Indian Department. The War Department was authorized by the President to chastise some of the warlike tribes. To accomplish this, General Sheridan drew up a plan. 3 armies would converge upon the savages. General George Crook would move north from Fort Fetterman in eastern Wyoming. Colonel John Gibbon would move east from Montana. General Alfred Terry, with Custer in command of the 7th, would move west from Dakota Territory. Crook probably was the most astute and experienced Indian fighter in the Army, known as a mean opponent, worse than a badger in a barrel. Captain Charles King, who served under him, said he had fought all the tribes on the western slope of the Rockies and most of those on the eastern side. Pitt River Indians sent an arrow through him in 1857, and since the day he took command against the Apaches in Arizona, no white man's scalp would bring the price his would, even in the most impoverished tribe on the continent. Indians knew Crook, not only by reputation, but by his singular appearance. Studio photographs show an erect, handsome, middle-aged officer in a proper military suit with brass buttons, a World War II haircut, and crinkly eyes that betoken a life spent outdoors, as well as an amiable disposition. In fact, he was not so amiable. His adjutant, Captain Bourke, called him reticent and taciturn, brusque to the point of severity. At work, he did not resemble the man in studio pictures. His beard forked beneath his jaw as though parted by a breeze, and he sometimes wrapped these halves in twine or braided them, perhaps to keep them out of the soup. With a nose like a knife and his split beard, he looks undeniably imperial, much like Lucas Cranach's portrait of Augustus, Grand Duke of Saxony. Those who knew the general said he could exist on slippery elm bark and acorns. He left Fort Fetterman on March 1, 1876, to round up and intimidate a wandering band of Sioux in southeastern Montana. Nobody anticipated much trouble. This would be little more than an excursion, a prelude to the full-dress summer campaign. On the banks of the Powder, his advance column under Colonel J.J. Reynolds pitched into a village thought to be that of Crazy Horse. The inhabitants fled. Reynolds captured the pony herd and a gratifying amount of property. According to Bourke, this village was provided with just about everything a savage could desire, and much besides that a white man would not disdain to class among the comforts of life. Among these comforts were elk skins and buffalo robes, wondrously embroidered with porcupine quills, fur couches, brilliantly painted valises made from pony hide, trunks for kitchen utensils. Bourke also mentions feathered war bonnets long enough to touch the ground. Concerning food, so much venison and buffalo meat that no adequate idea could be given. He estimated not less than 1,000 pounds. There was ammunition enough for a regiment, along with powder, pig lead, and molds for casting bullets. Only 3 of Reynolds' men were killed during this attack, though another was fatally wounded. The village had been seized, the enemy dispersed, all seemed well. But Reynolds panicked. Bourke says he concluded suddenly to withdraw. So abrupt was this withdrawal that the dead troopers were left behind, together with an injured man, Private Lorenzo Ayers, who would soon be chopped to pieces. At least that is the pale-face version of how Ayers died. Stanley Vestal talked with an old Indian who thought this story about Ayers might have gotten started because of a trick some Cheyennes played on a Sioux. After the battle, these Cheyennes were roasting pieces of meat when a Sioux named Little Shield came up and stood beside the fire warming himself. Little Shield was hungry, and because he did not know how to speak Cheyenne, he helped himself to a piece of meat. The Cheyennes watched him do this. Then they began talking among themselves. After Little Shield had swallowed the meat, one of the Cheyennes told him in sign language that they had found a fat soldier and cut him up, and what Little Shield had just eaten was soldier meat. The Cheyennes looked very serious. Little Shield was horrified. He did not know much about Cheyennes and thought maybe they were cannibals. So just because of this joke, Vestal was told, a lot of Sioux thought the Cheyennes had cut up a soldier, and finally the whites heard about it. Anyway, before withdrawing from the village, Reynolds set it afire, and as might be expected, teepees stuffed with ammunition did not merely burn. They exploded, says Bourke, launching 18-foot lodge poles into the atmosphere like skyrockets. It was a great wonder to me that some of our party did not receive serious injuries. That night the dispossessed natives recaptured most of their ponies and rode off, leaving Crook with not much to do except march back to Fort Fetterman, where he reported a victory over Crazy Horse. If a surprise assault at dawn may be so designated, this was a victory. But the Indians were not Oglala Sioux led by Crazy Horse. They were Sioux Cheyennes under the joint leadership of He-Dog and Old Bear. It appears that Crook's scout, Frank Gruard, recognized several of He-Dog's ponies, and because He-Dog ordinarily accompanied Crazy Horse, Gruard thought the celebrated chief must be present. In fact, He-Dog had left Crazy Horse, explaining that there were children who could not escape the soldiers and many frightened women, so he had decided to obey the government by going to the Red Cloud Agency. Old Bear, a Cheyenne, was doing the same. By other accounts, the Cheyennes had just left the agency, which would explain all the gunpowder, pig lead, and bullets. George Hyde, after talking to an old Cheyenne woman in 1912, became convinced this was indeed the village of Crazy Horse, augmented by 40 Cheyenne lodges. When the Indians scattered, she told him, Crazy Horse was seen running up a steep hillside with a child clinging to his back. Hyde is the one important scholar who believes it. Sioux and Cheyennes both were in the village, this has been established. One other thing is certain. Destroying so much food was uncommonly stupid, even for the army, because Crook's troops had almost nothing to eat. Bourke states that as a result of this victory, Crook aborted the expedition. We had no beef, as our herd had been run off on account of the failure to guard it. We were out of supplies, although we had destroyed enough to last a regiment for a couple of months. We were encumbered with sick, wounded, and cripples with frozen limbs. Because we had not had sense enough to save the furs and robes in the village, and the enemy was thoroughly aroused and would be on the qui-vive for all that we did. At the first bivouac, named Camp Inhospitality, they could not even feed the wounded. Here and there would be found a soldier or officer or scout who had carried a handful of cracker crumbs in his saddlebags, another who had had the good sense to pick up a piece of buffalo meat. Reynolds would be court-martialed 10 months later, as much for stupidity as cowardice. The court suspended him from rank and command for a year, but Grant remitted the sentence, and 6 months after that the colonel retired. As for the hungry, burned-out, freezing Indians, they traveled 3 days to the village of Crazy Horse, where they were given food and shelter. If they had been somewhat inclined to cooperate with the Great Father who lived beyond the sunrise in Never Never Land, this incendiary strike changed their disposition. Crazy Horse agreed to a military alliance with the refugees, and they decided to enlist the support of Sitting Bull's Unkpapas, who were encamped several days' travel northeast. Here the destitute people were again welcomed, as they knew they would be, for it was inconceivable to Indians that those who had plenty should fail to provide for those who had nothing. Wooden Leg said that when they reached Sitting Bull's camp, the Unkpapa squaws already had pots boiling. They were given all the meat they wanted and more. A herald rode through camp describing the wretched condition of these guests, so everybody brought presents. A 10-year-old Unkpapa girl gave Wooden Leg a buffalo robe. Whoever needed any kind of clothing got it immediately. They flooded us with gifts of everything needful. Crowds of their men and women were going among us to find out and supply our wants. Unkpapa, Unkpapa, Uncpapa, Hunkpapa. However this euphonious name is spelled, it means something, just as Oglala, Brule, and other Indian names have meaning. Unkpapa signifies an edge or a border, and it identified this tribe which traditionally camped at the village entrance. In other words, they camp by themselves. Oglala is difficult to translate. There was a derogatory gesture among these people, flicking the fingers, which might be likened to throwing dirt. And long ago, when they resolved to separate from their Brule relatives, the Oglalas expressed their feelings with this gesture. According to Hyde, "We have always known that the name Oglala means scattered, divided." He thinks it could have originated during the 18th century, when the Oglalas attempted, like the Mini-Conjou, to raise crops, and were therefore spoken of contemptuously as dust scatterers. Which is to say, somebody was finger-flicking the Oglalas, not vice versa. Maybe everybody did it, just as today a certain insulting gesture is commonplace. But the word might have meant wanderer, and because on one government treaty it has been spelled O''Galala, there are those who suspect these Indians must be Irish. Tom LaForge said finger-flicking was used also to identify Bannocks, whose lodges were not well kept. One signified Bannock by creating a teepee with the fingers, followed by that terrible gesture, bad lodge people, worthless lodge people. The Brule tribe was caught in a prairie fire sometime around 1763, and several people burned to death. Most escaped by running through the flames and jumping into a lake, but their legs were seared, which caused the tribe to become known by this characteristic disfigurement. Prince Paul of Württemberg, who visited the American West 3 times, encountered them in 1823 and understood the tribal name to be Cou Brule, burnt buttocks. Mini-Conjou signifies those who planted crops beside water. This band at one time had settled among the fortified village of corn-eating Rees along the Missouri, and tried to imitate the Ree pattern of life. After a while they gave up, because agriculture did not suit them, but apparently they kept at it longer than the Oglalas, long enough to be called Mini-Conjou. Wapitan Sioux lived among trees. Wapitan meant a village in the leaves. The usual English translation of Uhenompa, two kettle, might be more properly rendered as two cookings, because the chief of this band liked to brag that his hunters could supply meat enough for 2 meals. The Blackfeet, Sehasapa, may have gotten their name because they wore black moccasins, although James McLaughlin, who was for many years the agent at Devil's Lake and Standing Rock, believes the name originated with a family that arrived in camp wearing worn-out moccasins, their feet blackened because they had walked across a burnt prairie. These people were distinct from the Blackfoot, Siksika, who lived farther north and west, ranging into Canada, and who were related to the eastern Algonquins. As to why the Siksika were so called, maybe their moccasins were discolored by ashes and soot, because they often camped on fire-blackened ground. Those without bows, Sanzarks, got this name after some family or clan found itself disarmed, which was the fault of an hermaphrodite, or the fault of those who listened to him, her, it. These not-quite people lived out their existence among the Indians much as they do elsewhere, in terrible isolation. The year 1839 is recorded on an Unkpapa pictographic calendar as Winkte Pejiwan Isikati, the year an hermaphrodite committed suicide. Nevertheless, they had a certain status not granted to them in Anglo-European society. They were thought to possess great powers of divination, and therefore would be consulted on important business. So it happened that once upon a time an hermaphrodite advised his fellow tribesmen to place their weapons on a hilltop while he consulted the future. Most unwisely they did, and a hostile war party showed up. Other Sioux considered the resultant massacre to be very funny, and ever since then the foolish people have been called Sans Arcs. As for the generic word Sioux, Ralph Andrist calls it an etymological monstrosity, a truncation of Nadue Sioux, which in turn is a French form of the Chippewa Nadu is Iu, meaning little snake, in other words, an enemy. Dakota, a word meaning allies, is what they called themselves. More precisely, because the Yankton, Teton, and Santee Sioux all spoke different dialects, they should be referred to as Nakota, Lakota, and Dakota. So much for etymology. After deliberating with Sitting Bull, who thought the best way to negotiate with whites was to avoid them, the burned-out Cheyennes and Oglalas joined the Unkpapas. All three tribes then drifted in a northwesterly direction, meanwhile gathering strength from the Blackfeet, Sans Arcs, and from Lame Deer's Miniconjou. It had been agreed that the Cheyennes should travel at the head of this column, farthest from any pursuing bluecoats, which explains why Custer met them at the north end of the Serpentine village, and the powerful Unkpapas under Sitting Bull would guard the rear. Thus, when Reno charged the tail of the village, he had the misfortune to encounter these Unkpapas. In this manner, following game herds, a restless and wary conglutination of aborigines moved from one valley to the next. Meanwhile, back at Fort Fetterman, after his dubious success, General Crook was reorganizing. On May 29th, he again started north. Now, cooperating with General Terry and Colonel Gibbon, he was after Sitting Bull, and this time his baptized troops knew what to expect. On June 17th, in southern Montana, about 20 miles above the present Wyoming state line, he ran into a force of at least 1,000 warriors, Cheyennes, Oglalas, Sans Arcs, Miniconjou, Blackfeet, Unkpapas, who knew where to find him, and who had made a fast night march from their camp just east of the ridge which separates the valleys of the Little Bighorn and Rosebud. This unusual maneuver seems to have been the result of a conference among several chiefs who felt that Crook's army was a threat. These normally independent fighting men probably traveled in a disciplined column, with the flanks patrolled by warrior societies whose job was to keep ambitious braves from sneaking ahead and ruining the surprise. Woodenleg remembered it differently. Years later, he said the chiefs had decided to let these soldiers alone, but a great many young men, along with a few older ones, slipped out of camp and rode across the divide looking for a fight. However it came about, by dawn an immense throng of warriors had assembled in the Rosebud Valley. Here they watered their ponies and got dressed. Each man wanted to look his best when entering a battle from which he might not emerge, so each brought to the field a particular graphic idea. A Cheyenne named Black Sun, for instance, wore nothing but moccasins, a blanket around his loins, and the stuffed skin of a weasel on his head. He was mortally hit. He died several hours later, and the Cheyennes put his body in a hillside cave. Jack Red Cloud, son of the famous chief, wore his father's trail bonnet, which he should not have done, and borrowed his father's Winchester. He was just 18, clearly too young to be such a warrior as the bonnet proclaimed. Crook's Indian allies went after him. They shot his pony, and Jack Red Cloud then failed to do what a warrior should. Instead of first removing the bridle, he tried to escape. Not that a bridle was important. What mattered was to demonstrate courage and composure. 3 crows chased him. They lashed him with whips. One of them snatched the bonnet from his head. They took his father's gun, which was a present from the United States government, with Red Cloud engraved on it. By this time, Jack Red Cloud was crying. He begged the crows either to kill him or stop humiliating him. They hooted with laughter. Such embarrassing scenes alternated with moments of intense beauty. Chief Washakie, the great Shoshone, rode naked to the waist, wearing a bonnet with so many feathers that they swept the earth. The canyon was in bloom. It is said that the odor of blossoming crabapple, roses, and wild plum mingled sweetly with the dust and acrid smoke of black powder. Gunfire reverberating from the rocky walls echoed the rhythmic pounding of horses' hooves, dislodging thousands of petals, which drifted down like keepsakes among the desperate men. The fight lasted several hours. At times they battled hand to hand. Ex-trooper Phineas Town wrote to Cyrus Brady, I don't think I'd gone more than 10 yards when I was surrounded by about 20 or more of the most murderous-looking Indians I ever saw. You can talk of seeing devils. Here they were in full form, painted in the most terrifying manner, some with their war bonnets adorned with horns of steers and buffalo. It was enough to strike terror to anyone's heart. I knew that my time had come. I knew that I would be taken prisoner. I fought, but it was fighting against terrible odds. There I was down in that ravine alone and in the midst of a lot of murderous savages. Taking my carbine from me and throwing a lariat over my head and tightening it about my feet, I was helpless. This was all done in an instant while I struggled and fought in vain until I was struck on the head with something which rendered me unconscious and caused me to fall. As I went down, a bullet struck me in the body. I think that when the bullet struck me, I regained my consciousness, because I realized I was being dragged at a lively pace over the ground by a pony at the other end of the lariat. It was, I think, the intention of the Indians either to drag me to death at the heels of the pony, or after getting me away, to torture me in some other manner. They captured one other comrade of mine by the name of Bennett, of L Troop, 3rd Cavalry, and completely cut him in pieces. His remains were buried in a grain sack. After I was dragged in this manner for some distance, my captors were charged by one of the troops of cavalry, and to save themselves from capture, abandoned me. Military analysts today evaluate the Rosebud either as a standoff or something of a defeat for Crook, undoubtedly his least successful Indian fight. Numerically, it might be regarded as a success, because just 9 troopers and 1 Shoshone scout were killed, while the hostiles lost 30 or 40. Crazy Horse said 36. These numbers might have been much less favorable to General Crook if the concatenation of forces that annihilated Custer had been fully assembled. But 2 redoubtable war chiefs, Gall and Crow King, were absent. Bourke claimed it as a victory. He said they chased the enemy 7 miles and controlled the field, which is true. Otherwise, very little was accomplished. They had nothing but the remnants of the 4 days' rations with which they had started, so all they could do was return to the wagons. In any case, statistics seldom tell the story. Consider 1 dead Shoshone scout. A negligible loss, hardly worth the ink on a government ledger. His name has been forgotten. He was not even a warrior, just a boy. He had asked Chief Washaki's permission to visit a spring or tributary of the Rosebud in order to paint his face. He was almost ready to fight. His medicine song was half done, says Bourke, when a Sioux or Cheyenne found him, shot him through the back, and stripped the top of his head, from the nape of the neck to the forehead, leaving his entire skull ghastly and white. It was the boy's first battle. Plenty Coues, chief of the Crows, said this boy was not a Shoshone, but a Cree who had lived with the Crows for so many years that they thought of him as one of their own. Whatever his identity, he and 9 dead bluecoats were buried late at night in a deep trench beside the creek. These 10 bodies, counting Trooper Bennett's pieces in the grain sack, were covered with stones and earth. Then a bonfire was kindled on top and kept burning all night. Next morning, General Crook marched the entire command across the site to obliterate every trace of the excavation, for it was thought the savages might dig up and lacerate the cadavers. During the retreat, the Crows scored one last coup. They heard a voice begging for water. "Mini! Mini!" And they discovered a blind Cheyenne warrior hidden among the rocks. He had been led to this place, or had wandered there. When he heard the Crows talking among themselves, he mistook the language for Sioux and called out. The Crows responded by chopping off his arms and legs. Many strange sights were seen, Chief Plenty Coues remarked. He himself met a soldier riding very fast, with both arms hanging down like strips of bloody meat. The chief did not know who he was, but from the description this must have been a 3rd Cavalry trooper, Elmer Snow, who escaped with 2 badly crippled arms. Brevet Colonel Guy Henry took a bullet in the head, which pierced both cheekbones, smashed his nose, and destroyed one eye, according to journalist John F. Finnerty. Nevertheless, he somehow remained upright in the saddle, with blood gushing from his mouth while he tried to encourage the troops. He was spurring his horse forward to lead a charge when he fainted and toppled to the ground. Finnerty saw him later, more or less alive, with a blood-saturated cloth shielding his face from a cloud of flies, and tried to cheer him up. "It is nothing," the colonel replied. "For this we are soldiers." Brady's version is slightly less poetic. "It's all right, Jack. It's what we're here for." Nobody thought he could last the night, and as Colonel Henry listened to the mass grave being dug, he might have thought the same. If so, he refused to admit it. Captain Anson Mills, learning that he had been shot, went to visit, and inquired if he were badly hurt. "The doctors have just told me that I must die," said Colonel Henry, "but I will not." They carried him out of the valley feet first on a mule litter, but the poles were too short, and occasionally the second mule's head bumped Henry's head. Then they turned him around, which was more comfortable, although at any instant the front mule might kick his brains out. Captain Azer Nickerson states that during the retreat one of the litter poles struck a boulder on a mountainside and pitched Colonel Henry into some rocks 20 feet below. When they reached him, he was unable to speak. They wiped off the fresh blood and dirt and gave him a sip of water. And just how was he feeling? "Bully," whispered the half-dead colonel. He insisted he had never felt better, and he thanked them all for being so kind. Plenty Coups thought this was no way to carry a wounded man. A travois would not cause such pain. "I should have liked to tell the soldiers how to handle their chief, but they did not ask me." The colonel's personal account of being shot in the head, and his subsequent agony, is depreciated to the extent that it sounds ludicrous. The bullet stung, as though he had been slapped, and he did not realize he fell to the ground like a shotgunned mallard. He thought he dismounted and lay down. He must have been dimly conscious, because he could remember Sioux warriors charging by, and had it not been for the valiant Shoshone chief Washakie fighting above his prostrate body, he would have been finished off and scalped. Concerning the trip back, he mentions a detail Finnerty missed. A mule did kick him in the face. This by itself would eliminate quite a few men. Not Colonel Henry. Because the Sioux might resume hostilities at any time, General Crook ordered a fast retreat. The mules were flogged into a trot, and he concedes that he found this motion unpleasant. Indeed, he admits, death would have been preferable. Nights were so cold that ice formed. He welcomed the low temperature because he did not bleed as much. While crossing the Tongue River, he was nearly washed overboard. At the Goose Creek base camp, they set up a tent to protect him from the sun and put a mattress under him, which he considered a luxury. During the next 200 miles, his escort managed to shoot a few little birds. These were boiled, and the broth poured down his throat. Now and then he got a teaspoonful of brandy. They reached the North Platte across from Fort Fetterman just as the ferryboat cable snapped. Henry calls this a disappointment. Within sight of houses and beds, they would be obliged to camp once more. But an officer from Fetterman crossed the Platte in a skiff and told the colonel they would try to get him to the fort if he would take the chance of capsizing. By this time Henry was totally blind and probably had not much more than a pint of blood in his body. If the skiff capsized, he would drown. He said he was willing to take the chance. With the officer cradling Henry in his arms, 2 enlisted men paddling, they got across. He was now 300 miles beyond the frontier. A week later, he had survived a jolting field ambulance trip to Medicine Bow, where the Union Pacific stopped. He got there on July 4th, when everybody in town was drunk, yelling, firing guns. A bullet zipped through his tent. Next day, they loaded him aboard a train bound for civilization.